Welcome back. All right. So technically today, as I'm recording this, is December the 8th. It is the 2 month anniversary of the NHL season getting started, and that's when I like to do the look at the standings and where we're at once a month. But since it was hockey all day, I was like, well, I can't do partial results, so I'm doing this after the review on Sunday night, and it'll post to the channel Monday morning, so that works. So the Florida Panthers are first currently in the Atlantic Division, a record of 17-9-2. They have 36 points in 38 games. Over their last 10 games, they're 5-4-1, but they're definitely trending in the right direction. At this time last year, so on this date last year, 16-8-2 was their record. So very similar record to last year. Very, very similar. The Toronto Maple Leafs, 16-9-2. They have 34 points in 27 games. They're 7-3 in their last 10. At this point last season, they were 13-6-4. So they were 7 games above 500, and this season they're 7 games above 500. So while there's all this talk about how different everything is in Toronto and all that, the record's almost the same. So at least in terms of how many games above NHL 500 they are. The Boston Bruins are 15-11-3 for 33 points in 29 games. They're 7-3 in their last 10. Last year at this time, 17-5-3 was their record, as Jim Montgomery got them to incredible records the 2 years he was there. Not so much this year, so they fire him. And Boston's trended in the right direction since naming Joe Sacco the head coach. And it's allowed for a little bit of separation between the top three and the next one, but we'll get there. So the Washington Capitals leading the Metro, 27 games, a record of 19-6-2 for 40 points. They're 7-2-1 in their last 10. They're 12-8-3 last year at this time. So they've gone from 4 games above 500 to 13 games above 500 on the same date. So that's a huge improvement right there. Although they only played 23 games last year on this date, they've played 27, so a little different there. But either way, the Capitals having an excellent season, and they're 2 points clear of New Jersey while they have 3 games in hand on New Jersey. New Jersey 18-10-2, 38 points in 30 games. They're 6-4 in their last 10. At this point last season, they were 13-10-1. So for New Jersey, the record definitely better this year than last year. The Carolina Hurricanes, 17-9-1, 35 points in 27 games. But over their last 10, they're 4-5-1. Interestingly enough, on this date last year, 14-11-1 was their record. They'd had that really rough trip through the West Coast last year by this time, and they were starting to dig their way out of the mess they'd made. But yeah, it was a tough start. So you're gonna have those ebbs and flows, and right now, Carolina going through it, but I think they'll come out the other side a better team. Tampa Bay's the number one wild card, but you'll notice they have 4 games in hand on Boston, 2 games in hand on Toronto. They're 14-9-2. They have 30 points in 25 games. They're 6-3-1 in their last 10. So they're almost keeping pace with Boston and Toronto. And over the last 10 games, they've caught up by 2 points on the Florida Panthers. They were 12-11-5 at this time last year. So Tampa Bay is better than they were last season, which could be bad news for everybody. If the playoffs started today, you'd have Florida against Tampa Bay. You'd have Toronto against Boston, New Jersey against Carolina, and the Capitals would get the Rangers, with the script being flipped in that the Rangers would be the number 2 wild card. They're 14-11-1, 29 points in 26 games, 3-7 over their last 10. At this time last year, they were 18-5-1, and the good times were rolling. Everything was great. They had a pretty good run in the playoffs, and this year it's gotten kind of ugly. Now, just below the playoff line, but also with 29 points, somehow it's the Islanders, 11-11-7. They're 4-4-2 in their last 10, and you really want something to chuckle about? At this time last year, they were 11-7-7. They know how to collect overtime and shootout lost points, which, while we do get a laugh out of it, those are points they're getting by not losing in regulation. So something the Islanders are doing that I'm kind of in some way glad hasn't caught on around the NHL, because if we had a whole bunch of teams with a whole lot of those extra time points, the standings would be kind of a mess. Philadelphia, 28 games, 12-12-4 record, 28 points. So 1 point behind the Rangers, but the Rangers have 2 games in hand. Philadelphia is 4-4-2 over their last 10, and actually the record isn't as good as it was at this time last year. They were 14-10-2. Pittsburgh, 12-13-4 record, 28 points in 29 games, but they're 6-3-1 in their last 10, so they're playing well. Last year at this time they were 11-12-3, so the record's about the same this year as it was last year. Columbus, 12-12-3 record for them, 27 points. They're 6-3-1 in their last 10. 9-15-5 was their record at this time last year. So definitely an improvement for Columbus, which I don't think very many of us saw coming. So far Columbus is doing well. They're only 2 points out of a playoff spot. Buffalo, 27 games, 11-13-3 record, 25 points. They're 3-5-2 in their last 10 games. I did skip Ottawa. We'll go back to Ottawa. Well, we'll continue with Buffalo here. At this time last year, they were 11-14-2. So they're 1 point better than they were a year ago on this date. I'm pausing for the celebration. Ottawa, 12-13-2 record, 26 points in 27 games. They're 4-5-1 in their last 10. They were 10-11 on this date last year. 1 game below 500 last year, 1 game below 500 this year. Song remains the same. Detroit, 10-13-4 record, 24 points. They're 3-4-3 in their last 10. One thing with Detroit, last year they got off to a great start. They were 14-7-4 on this date a year ago. So that's a problem. Detroit doesn't have that great start this year. Now they're going to have to rally. And as now they sit 5 points back of a playoff spot, the odds of a rally just seem to get longer and longer. Montreal, also 27 games, 10-14-3 record, so 23 points for them. They're 5-4-1 in their last 10. 11-12-3 was their record a year ago. So their record is worse than what it was last year, although they're trending in a better direction. They do find themselves 6 points out of the playoffs, which isn't really a surprise. Montreal not expected to be a playoff team this year. So in the East, it is interesting that I think the only team above the playoff line that didn't make it last year is New Jersey. Yep, and the only team below the playoff line that made it would be the Islanders, right? So things have stayed kind of the same in the East as last year, and that is one thing about from one year to the next. It's normally kind of how that works. So let's go out west, shall we? We'll start with Minnesota, 27 games, 18-5-4 record for 40 points. 7-2-1 in their last 10 games. On this date last year, they were 9-12-4. So Minnesota had a rough start to the season, and they never really quite got it together. This year, they've got it together. The Winnipeg Jets are tied in points. They have a record of 20-9. They've played 29 games, so they've played 2 more games than have the Minnesota Wild. Over their last 10, though, it's been a rough go of it for Winnipeg. They're 4-6. On this date last year, they were 15-8-2. So they're still ahead of last year's numbers, but it definitely looks like Winnipeg's fallen back to earth. They have the loss tonight against Columbus at home, and these are ones that can come back to bite you when you get around to playoff seeding later on. Dallas, 27 games, 17-10 record, 34 points. They're 6-4 in their last 10. 15-7-3 was their record a year ago, so they were 8 games above 500 then. They're 7 games above 500 now. Very similar numbers with Dallas, and honestly, I've been kind of disappointed with Dallas, comparatively speaking, to what I expected, but they're still in the running. They're 6 points back of first place in their division. Vegas, 28 games, 18-7-3 record for them, 39 points. They're 7-2-1 in their last 10, and a year ago at this time, they were 17-5-5. So the record actually was a little bit better last year than it is this year, but I don't think anybody's going to complain about Vegas with the 39 points at this point. The LA Kings, 16-8-3 this year, 35 points in 27 games. They're 7-3 in their last 10. Interestingly enough, they had a better record a year ago at this time, 16-4-3. So the LA Kings, currently second in the division, and would host the Vancouver Canucks if the playoffs started today. Vancouver's 14-8-4, 32 points in 26 games. They're 5-4-1 in their last 10. Last year at this time, they were 17-9-1. So they were 8 games above 500. Now they're 6 games above 500. Definitely not the same start Vancouver had last year, but the fact that they're above the playoff line is good. It's good news. Then you've got the Oilers, 27 games, 15-10-2 record for 32 points. They're 6-3-1 in their last 10 games. The Oilers last year at this time were 11-12-1. So they're better than they were last year at this time, and they are definitely trending in the right direction. Slowly catching up to the Canucks. They have the same number of points. They've just played one more game than has Vancouver. Colorado, 29 games, a record of 16-13, 32 points for them. They're 6-4 in their last 10. Really, with Colorado, what separates them is just they haven't lost any in extra time. They're all regulation losses. They were 16-8-2 at this time last year. So this year, they're not doing as well as last year, but they're starting to figure it out. They haven't allowed that much in terms of goals over the last 2 games. I believe 1 goal in the last 2 games. That's what they needed to clean up. If they can keep that going, they should stay above the playoff line. They are the number 2 wild card. So if the playoffs started today, I'm going to apologize to Minnesota fans because Minnesota would get Colorado. Yeah. Vegas would get Edmonton. Winnipeg would play Dallas. LA would play the Vancouver Canucks. So you'd get some matchups that we're familiar with, but you wouldn't get Edmonton and LA until Edmonton's actually past Vancouver, and then we get Edmonton and LA again for 4th year in a row. Calgary, 28 games. They're below the playoff line, 13, 10, and 5, 31 points. They do have a game in hand on Colorado. They're just the 1 point back, but they're 4, 4, and 2 in their last 10. They were 11, 12, and 3 at this point last season. So better record than last year, but not a lot better. And it does feel like for Calgary, they're slowly moving in the wrong direction. Seattle, 29 games for them, a record of 14, 14, and 1, 29 points. They're 5 and 5 over their last 10. At this point last season, 8, 13, and 6 was the record. So definitely improvement over last year, and they are only a few points back of a playoff spot. Utah, only 4 points back, 12, 11, and 4 record in 27 games, so 28 points. They're 5, 4, and 1 in their last 10. Arizona at this point last year was 13, 10, and 2. Arizona's numbers got really awful when we found out they were likely going to be moving, and you could tell that distracted the team. So Utah shouldn't have that kind of a chasm in the middle of their season. They should be able to stay in the running. St. Louis, 28 games, 13, 13, and 2 record for 28 points. Definitely better under Jim Montgomery. They're 5, 4, and 1 in their last 10. At this point last season, 13, 12, and 1. So this year's record is not a lot different than last year's record. San Jose, 10, 15, and 5 record for 25 points in 30 games. They're 4, 5, and 1 in their last 10. At this point last season, they were 8, 17, and 2. So they've improved by 4 points from where they were last season. That's not true. They've improved by a lot of points actually from last season. They were 9 games below 500. Now they're 5 games below 500. It's a gradual thing to build towards a good team for San Jose. At least they're building. Anaheim, it may not feel like it, but they're kind of building as well. 10, 12, and 3 record, 23 points. They're 5, 4, and 1 in their last 10. At this time last year, they were 10 and 16. And I believe they started last season 9 and 6. So they got ugly for Anaheim fast last year. Nashville, 7, 15, and 6 record, 20 points. I did the video on them today, of course. So they're sitting 12 points back of a playoff spot. And once you reach those double digits, you can kind of kiss a playoff spot goodbye. There are those rare instances where a team that's more than 10 points back at this stage of the season might go on a run. It is very rare that takes place. So Nashville, 2, 5, and 3 in their last 10. At this time last year, they were 14 and 12. So they had their slow start last season. They had already turned it around and started going in the right direction. Chicago, almost the same record as last year. 8, 17, and 2 this year, 18 points. They're 2, 7, and 1 in their last 10. And of course, their coach is out. They were 8, 16, and 1 last year at this time. So they've played 2 extra games from last year, and they've lost both of them. 1 in extra time and 1 in regulation. So Chicago finds themselves 14 points back of a playoff spot. So that 10-point line, Montreal hasn't reached it yet. They're only 6 points back. It takes 32 points to make the playoffs in the West. It takes 29 points to make the playoffs in the East. This is where people say, well, the East is a lot stronger than the West. But in the East, you have some mediocre records here too. It is not the same as it seems to usually be in the East, but it may trend in that direction. I can't see the Rangers staying this bad for much longer. I'd be very surprised if that happens. So out West, which teams are above the playoff line that didn't make it last year? I think it's just Minnesota. Yeah, I think it's Minnesota. And Nashville's the only team that's dropped out that made the playoffs last year. So by my count, there's 2 teams currently above the playoff line who did not make it last season. So before the season got started, we had the polls on the channel of where everybody thought teams were going to finish. And there was a lot of comments about how those polls seemed to just look at the standings from last season and didn't understand things could change greatly. They generally haven't. And so this is definitely a talking point, I would think, is from one season to the next. Are we now looking at a league of haves and have-nots? How long is that drought going to last for Ottawa, Buffalo, and Detroit, who always seem to be in this kind of a spot? At some point in the season, and then they all miss. So let me know your thoughts. Which team that's currently below the playoff line do you think they can go on a run? Which team above the playoff line do you think could drop out? Let me know your thoughts. Hit like and subscribe if you haven't done so already. Thank you guys so much for all your support as always. I will talk to you again soon.